conference. It was a National Native Youth Conference, so it was like, we were the only two Eskimos there, and so we made that known or whatever. We weren't quiet about it. And, at that point, that we were Eskimo, that we were different from them, and that they need more representation for us Eskimos. And so there was a short native lady. I can't remember where she was from, but it was Arizona, New Mexico area. She was from over there, and she went to us after we had said something, we had the mic and stuff, we were saying it in front of people, at a large gathering and stuff. So she went to us. You should be asking your elders if you can be saying Eskimo at a place like this. You should ask permission to be calling yourself that. And I was like, what? Our elders are the ones who let us know that we're Eskimo. Just they're okay with it. I couldn't think of any elder or any reference that ever said we're not Eskimo. Don't call yourself that. And so that's kind of what pushed me into that way. What is the issue or whatever? And then I know, in Canada, the way that people are trying to change Washington Redskins, they have a football team called Edmonton Eskimos. So they're trying to change that, but it was always outsiders that made me rethink my use for the term Eskimo. And I'm like, who are you to tell me what I should and should not be offended by? But also, there is a reason they knew that. And I was like, well, why don't I know that?
There are different opinions between Inuit groups, even different opinions from person to person about the context of the word Eskimo. Here, Jackie explains what she learned from some Inuit friends from Canada.
I did read about this naming system that the Canadian government used on the kids that they took into boarding schools. And they were basically dog tags. They were just round leather tags. They're called Eskimo identification tags. And they had a number because they couldn't say their names and they didn't have any last names. And so it was a medical examiner or something that, was kind of frustrated by, because they were trying to start with fingerprints at first or whatever for some kind of identification system. But he was frustrated that they didn't have last names that he can organize them by or whatever. And so he was the one that suggested that they start having these tags and they have a number on them. And so it's E and then a number or whatever, or W and a number, and that kind of is their East or West Canada. So it was their last name. I'd be Jackie E 727. That would be my name. That literally on governmental papers, on registration, all of that stuff. And the surprising fact for me is that it wasn't until between 1968 and 1971 where, I should remind you, that's when INCSA was happening. At that time, that's when they finally changed the names in, systems and registrations. And so it's somebody born as early or as recently as 1981, they were, their name and a number at the end. And so there was a guy, the first Inuit to be into office, he got some other guy to help him, so he flew around to, he had to explain it to people too, where it's just you're gonna have a last name now or whatever. He had to explain that to them, and so they, a lot of them went to what their family name was, names that were in their family, and so it's that recent as the 70s that they finally stopped giving them numbers. And so I think that that's a big part of why it was racist in Canada and why it's such a bigger conversation, is because they literally had their identity stripped from them at a young age, and that was their governmental name. And even as recently as 5 years ago, someone got a mailing that was, it'd be Jackie E 727, just, in the 2010s. And so that's where a lot of the fiery things come from, and it's just not something that we have seen in Alaska's history. I feel they lost their identity at boarding schools, but they also still, my grandparents still had their names. My Anna was Lydia Wells. I don't know if they had numbers or what, but they still had names. They weren't walking around with dog tags. I think the wildest thing for me, now that I'm out of those early college years where I was still trying to find my place and my identity, that still just kind of rubs me the wrong way, or I just see it differently because I'm more in tune with who I am and what it means to be who I am. The college that I went to in Idaho, so in general we have heard probably the term Eskimo brother or Eskimo sister. find it on Urban Dictionary. When that first came out, you wrote in Eskimo, and you're like, oh, Eskimo brothers, thought you guys sleep with the same people. And that, like, you know, that stems from, you know, they used to have multiple wives or multiple husbands.
See, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, what is that? How did that even come from an Eskimo, like, the term Eskimo? Mm-hmm. I had no idea.
Yeah, me neither. That's why I, like, looked it up, like, in college, because, you know, they'd make those terms or whatever. But anyways, so there was this group of guys at my college. They called themselves IEG, and that stood for Idaho Eskimo Gang. And so when I heard it, I was like, what? That's a little bit too, like, how I learned what the term is, Eskimo brothers, you know, and they called themselves that. Well, they'd be like, we're cold as ice, or whatever, you know. They had, like, all had their Twitter names, like, Antarctic and hypothermic and whatever. They were, like, stereotyping that, but also it was a branch off of they all sleep with the same girls. They all just, you know, put them in rounds, and that's, like, its own issue in itself. But to, like, use our people as a way to, like, reference something that we traditionally believed in and, like, practice or whatever. There was this guy that even had, like, a tattoo of an igloo on him, like, literally tatted himself with an igloo, like. But also, like, now that I'm older and, like, think about it more, I'm just like, damn, like, even that is just a whole nother, like, level of disrespect to who we are and ignorance to what our people are and what they've believed in and what they've done traditionally. That just blows my mind that people can be that way.
Yeah. For many, the history of racism and stereotypes of the Inuit being barbaric, dirty, uneducated, or uncivilized still have negative influences over what non-natives think about Eskimos.
At Idaho, we were under the Western Undergraduate Exchange Program, so we had cheaper tuition, and so all the people that I met, there were a lot of Alaskans. I was very surprised by that, but a lot of them were from Anchorage or, like, southeast area. But there was this, like, one time, too, where, you know, it was, like, almost end of the year. So at that point, like, I just knew that was, like, a really good icebreaker, was that I'm Eskimo. And it was just, like, a lot of people, like, let me be proud of that. And they were, like, fascinated by it. But there was a guy that, he's from here in Anchorage, and he went to South High School. And, you know, so I told him, I was like, what? Because someone was like, he's from Alaska, too. And so I was being all excited, you know, and so, like, I made a comment about being Eskimo, and he literally made a vomiting face. And he was like, you're native. Like, he literally straight up made a vomiting face. And I just freaked out. I didn't know how to take that. Like, because at that point, I wasn't even aware that there were racists within Alaska. Like, I knew, like, our teachers kind of were, but I didn't spend enough time in Fairbanks and Anchorage to really know that that is an issue here. And so, like, when it comes to, like, Eskimo being offensive or an insult, like, I feel like that's not necessarily true, like, America in general, but I do feel like there needs to be a discussion on, like, weight that comes with being native and the comments that are made about being native and how that's putting us into stereotypes, not the way, like, Eskimo is put into a, like, cartoon stereotype, living with polar bears and igloos or whatever, but as, like, a stereotype of being drunks and alcoholics, you know, abusers and, you know, drug abusers and all of this stuff. Like, I really feel like that needs to be a conversation too, where we can't, like, have all that weight that comes with saying that you're native. I've heard that also just, like, downstates when it comes to Native Americans too, you know, I feel like a lot of those things also linger where it's just like, you're not called native as a compliment. Like, you know, there have been times where, you know, people are just like, well, she's too native, or, like, she's just being native, or, like, I hope she's not one of those kinds of natives, or, like, even just within our own types of people where she's like, she's a different native, she's a city native, or whatever. You know, there's a lot of, like, weight that comes on to talking about being natives as well that, like, goes beyond of Eskimo offensiveness. You know, I was painting a picture for myself that I didn't realize I was doing when I said I was Eskimo. It's the same way with him, where when I said it to him, I didn't realize I immediately was putting myself into the, like, straight, complete opposite negative stereotype of what it means to be native, you know. And it's just like, I don't know, like, it makes me speechless, where I'm just like, damn, like, you grew up here, but you have no respect, and, like, you'd literally make a vomiting face at me. That's just crazy.
As millennials, we kind of live in between this world of Googling things and accessing traditional passed down knowledge through elders. And this can be an awkward and confusing space at times.
when I was doing, like, the research on, like, the origin of Eskimo and the history or whatever, which, like, I'll say again, like, it's a really weird experience to be, like, a Inuit woman sitting at the computer researching why or why not I should call myself Inuit or Eskimo. Like, it's just, you know, I don't even think, like, our ancestors or even just a few generations older than us can, like, understand that this kind of, like, identity crisis can exist, and this kind of soul searching basically can exist, like, through the internet, but also that we, like, find that stuff through outsiders. How can we shift from that where, well, first of all, that, like, the younger generation can grow up in general just knowing these things, that it doesn't have to become a hot topic when they're young adults and they're like, well, who am I as a person or whatever. But also, you know, like, I hope and I wish that, and it is happening to some extent, but I feel like you still need more of willingness to teach, and, like, our public system needs to, like, be adjusted to be able to, like, have these resources come from the right lens and come from the right people. And it doesn't have to be, if someone wants to, like, dive deep into those kinds of things, they should, but it shouldn't be through such, like, foreign resources. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so while I was searching, I also saw that they, like, you know, some people kind of believe that it could be from a Latin word that, like, is related to, it's like excommunicati or something, like something about, like, excommunicated or something, and it's about, like, because we weren't Christian. Yeah, so it's just, like, the Latin word that has to go with, like, being not Christian. If Eskimo stems from that, like, it's just like, well, then yeah, I'm an Eskimo, because, like, we weren't actually Christian, and, like, that's not a bad thing. But it's also, like, you think about it, we do, you know, kind of like Inuit and Christian spirituality kind of go hand in hand these days. It's just, like, crazy to, like, think, like, first of all, that you don't even know where this word is really coming from, and that's what you go by and that's what you identify with, but you don't know the history of it. It's just kind of frustrating, because it's like, you think about, like, the Holocaust and how, you know, we learn a lot about it, and how it's like, you know, it was like one of the biggest genocides out there. From the way I see it, it's just, like, the biggest documented genocides. They were taking pictures, you know, there's videos, all of this stuff about what happened, but there's none of that for us. Like, they weren't documenting that stuff. And so there is, like, a trivial side to that. How erased are we, and, like, how do we paint that picture back in, you know, like, how do we make sense of things again when it's not even out there to understand in the first place?
With all these terms, right, to, like, set, like, a snowshoe thing, or, like, a, you know, one who doesn't believe in Christian faith, and,
or, like, one who eats raw meat, like,
yeah,
like, those aren't the three, like, factors of who we are. But it's like,
it's so frustrating, because you're right, it's so one-dimensional, and we were civilized people. People thought that we weren't civilized. People thought that we didn't have our own, like, form of government, form of systems that we had in place. So frustrating that people, they can call us that, and that's going to be our name from here on out. Mm-hmm. And for us to embrace it today is so crazy to me. Even though I'm not, like, offended by it, but when you really, really think about the root, and really think of how it stemmed, and such misunderstanding and such stereotyping.
Yeah. For instance, for me, like, I've been trying to learn Inuit a lot lately, and understanding the structure of our language and how words and sentences are made. And in a lot of the resources that I have to be able to learn that stuff, I don't take too much, you know, I don't put too much energy there, because on, like, whether or not I want to be called Eskimo or not, you know, I don't put too much energy there, because, you know, my energy is more in other places, I guess. But it's starting to finally bother me when I'm, like, trying to learn this language, because in the translations in a lot of old things, like Inuit ngurunga for, like, I'm Inuit, but in the translation it'll say I am Eskimo, or, like, Inuit rock, you know, to speak Eskimo or whatever, instead of, like, to speak Inuit. And, like, a lot of that, from what I'm learning just in general of, like, how to speak, but also just the different subgroups of who we are as Inuit, and how, like, expansive that is, and how diverse we all are, even though we are all so similar. There are so many different categories to us, you know. There, just here in Alaska right now, there's Inuit and Yupik, and then there's in Russia, there's Siberian Yupik, and even within there, you know, they have different things. They have, like, Chaplano, Yupik, you know, they have their own, like, kind of like how we do, dialects and different types of people. Like, even within Inupiaq people in Alaska, there's North Slope Inupiaq, Northwest Arctic Inupiaq, and Bering Strait Inupiaq, and we're all different. We all know that. We're all different from each other. And then, you know, you go to Canada, and they have this